Hi, so good morning, class. We have Carolyn Hoyt here to present on a book entitled Genesis and the Big Bang. So let's show her our love. Yes, she presents.
Okay. Well, I saw this in the science section, and I had to read it because I took astronomy class with Dr. Ball, so we talked a lot about this stuff already. And it really was a very interesting book, so I would recommend reading it. He has a kind of interesting, talkative sort of style of writing, so it's very readable. The author is Gerald L. Schroeder. He is a Orthodox Jewish man, a physicist. He also does a lot of lecturing and teaching, and obviously he is an author as well. So the story that prompted the writing of this book was they were living, his family, at the time in Zikron Yaakov, how do you pronounce it, in Israel, which is near Mount Carmel. And not too far away there was an archaeological dig. And I guess one day, or perhaps it had been an ongoing thing, but they uncovered some fossils which were claimed to be about 60,000 years old or something like that. And so his son came to him, and he had this conflict because in Christian tradition, he had learned that the earth is 6,000 years old, so how is it possible that these fossils can be that old? There must be something wrong with the science. So Josh, among many others, saw this discord between science and the scriptures, but Schroeder suggests that there isn't any discord. This is an imagined thing. And so his quest was kind of to show that there is a unity between both. So the sources he used in the writing of this book came from two sides. For scripture, which were primarily concerning Genesis, he chose commentaries that he said had withstood the test of time. So one of these was Onkelos, who translated originally the 5 books of Moses into Aramaic. And then Rashi, who does a lot of interpretations of biblical words and phrases. And then Maimonides, who discusses perplexing, he calls them, aspects of Scripture, one of which is the creation story. And then the last author, which talks about tradition and mysticism. And then from the science side, if you will, he chose a lot of acclaimed scientists, including physicists and cosmologists, geophysicists, biologists, and molecular chemists. So he has pretty thorough and trusted sources that he's using. He starts off by talking about time and our perception of time. If we look at what we call the biblical calendar in Genesis, which is taken primarily from genealogies, we get the idea that there are 6,000 years total that the world has existed. However, the scientific calendar suggests that it's more like 15 billion years. And a lot of that comes from carbon-14 dating and finding the age of starlight, as well as theories on evolutionary development. So there seems to be this big discrepancy between the two. But Schroeder says, with surprising convincingness, that both can be true. And so he goes on to talk about relativity. He uses the idea of reference frames, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. He talks about a difference between the observer and the observed. And in creation, there was no observed, which is man, until the 6th day when he was created. So that is something we have to consider when thinking about the creation story. That only God was there to observe the first 6 days, first 5 days. He then gives an example of time, a study that was done with time clocks and jets, where they had clocks that were coordinated on jets with the clocks, the regular clocks, I guess, on Earth. And then they were sent around from west to east, along with the spin of the Earth, so that the spin of the Earth would be adding to the jet speed. And they found that the clocks gained time. Not as much time had passed with the jet clocks as had passed on Earth. So that was interesting. He also talked about time dilation with this particle known as the meson, which I believe is a theoretical particle. But he was talking about how it's produced near Earth's atmospheres as the rays from the sun strike the atmosphere. And then those rays give so much energy to these particles that they start traveling towards Earth around light speed. In theory, they should decay before they reach the Earth, given even travel at light speed. However, what they found was that 1/8 of the particles reached the surface. And in looking at the half-lives of these particles, basically they determined that for these particles, only 4.5 microseconds had passed, when it should take 200 microseconds to travel from the surface of the Earth to, from the atmosphere to the surface of the Earth. So what he's saying is this is an example of the same event, but there's two true times. So he brought this into play in comparison with the story of Genesis, of the creation. His idea is that it's possible that both 15 billion years and 6 days happened at the same time. So that was kind of a mind-blowing idea to me. I'd never heard that before. He then goes on to go generally, basically day by day, according to the Genesis account of creation, and contrasts the language used in Scripture to how science would describe it happening. And he describes the Scriptures as being written in the language of man, whereas I would call the way he uses science as the language of nature. So, on the first day, we have God saying, putting light into existence, and the commentaries that he uses describe the universe as, they just say that the universe is described as being contained in a mustard seed, which is really similar to how science would describe the original stuff that makes up the universe being contained within less than a micron. But then you have this big explosion. And the Scripture talks about there being the wind of God that took on form. And science will say that the ethereal substance, which was kind of, I think I've heard of it described as dark energy, but they describe it being transformed into atomic particles. And that's kind of found with the E=mc² equation, which basically shows that energy and mass can interconvert. And so science would describe originally there just being this energy, which became photons, which became matter. And that sounds a lot like the Genesis description of there initially being light, which light literally is photons, according to science. And then he talks about what the phrase, and it was good, means, and it doesn't necessarily mean the quality that it doesn't necessarily mean like it was a really good quality, but it means literally that there was order made from chaos. So then he talks about the origin of life. Science would have life coming from the inert, and there are a number of ways that this could be. Some have suggested random mutation, but he's saying there's not enough time for a gradual process of random mutation for all of the complexity that we see today to have come about, given that the age of the Earth is 15 billion years. So some people have tried to answer that question by saying that there was this extraterrestrial seeding of the Earth, but then that prompts the question, where did the extraterrestrials come from? So ultimately he says there must have been some kind of intervention. There are these natural processes, but there wasn't just this random, gradual process of evolution. And he used that to lead into the idea of punctuated evolution, which we talked a bit about in class. And he reflects this with the story in Genesis, the earth bringing forth grass. To him, that sounds like the earth itself is kind of producing this life. So he suggests that perhaps the earth was created with the inherent potential to bring forth life. He then turns to the development of man. He says it makes sense that the plants were created first, according to the scriptural reading, because the plants help provide an atmosphere that would be suitable for life, for animal life. He talks about the various theories in science, how common DNA and RNA suggests there's a common ancestor, punctuated evolution, which he says was punctuated by mass extinctions, major events. An example he gave was a large meteor striking that wiped out the dinosaur life and allowed for smaller, sturdier life, such as possibly the pre-man, I forget what they're called, animals to thrive. And he says that we have evidence for humanoid creatures from at least 3 million years ago. And so we have to face this question that either the fossils were placed there to test our faith, or the fossils are faithful representatives of what happened. So we have to choose. In talking about Genesis account, he pulls out phrases such as made from the dust of the earth, and Adam means of the red earth or soil, to indicate maybe that this is describing the same thing as science. And he suggests that perhaps the hour when God said, "Let us make man in our image," was not referring necessarily to the Trinitarian God, but that it was referring to God and earth together. He says that one of his commentaries describes humanoid creatures existing at the time of Adam with the same capabilities and intelligence, but they had no soul. But he says, since Adam, the time frames of God and man have met, so we can still follow those genealogies that we see in Scripture. Essentially, he's saying that we're not necessarily special in body or brain capabilities, but in the soul that God imprinted upon us. So he asked 3 questions in summary. 1, can we see that these events of creation are leading towards some special purpose, or are they kind of just random? 2, is uniqueness of the universe and the complexity so unlikely as to point towards outside involvement? And 3, he asks, is the biblical view of the creation similar enough to the scientific view to require an explanation? In other words, is this a way we can show that what we read in Scripture is true? So he answers each of these questions. He says, from a secular point of view, events may seem random, but if you consider the universe as a whole, a purpose in the creation leading up to eventually man becomes evident. He says we can't prove divine guidance merely from the existence of complexity. This is still a matter of faith. And then he says that similarities between biblical and scientific views are striking, and it's something that everyone should consider. So here are the themes that I got out of it. It was interesting to me how he described Scripture as being the language of man. Basically, he's saying that Scripture was written in a way that we could understand, not necessarily in a way that we're supposed to look at under a magnifying glass in order to determine things as far as literal statements. He suggests that both Scripture and science are saying the same thing regarding the creation story, but each was written to different purposes. It was interesting to me how he rethinks science to fit traditional theological views, especially with the example he gave of time dilation and how maybe 15 billion years and 6 days could have happened at the same time. And he also represents traditional theological views to be different than what we might have thought conventionally. So that's what I got out of the book. Like I said at the beginning, I would recommend it. He does a very thorough job of discussing both scripture and science and trying to bring a unity between the both. It's a very interesting read. Any questions?
All right, questions for Ms. Hoyt? So the 2 times are 6 days for God, his time perspective, and the billions of years from our perspective.
Basically. I kind of understood it like when you watch a video and you fast forward it. Technically the video is longer, but you're watching it fast forwarded, so it takes less time. That was the only way I could kind of understand what he was saying. But
So when Darby was talking about his 3 approaches here, separation, faith, and science, or the concordist view that they fit together somehow, and then the last one I never quite understood, the partial something. Which one do you think this is of those 2? Is it a separation or is it a concordance?
that they should fit together, but one doesn't necessarily prove the other, if that makes sense. Science doesn't prove that God exists, and we can't necessarily use Scripture as a scientific textbook.
They something fit together.
But they do fit together.
So I think most people would call for the concordist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you know if he's Jewish, definitely by birth, life and everything. Do you know, is he a Christian Jew or is he still a Jewish Jew?
He talks about Judeo-Christianity.
Uh-huh.
I think he would profess to be a Christian.
Okay.
He didn't mention Christ in the book at all, so I don't know for certain. But,
And certainly the topics that you talk are common to both the Jewish
Right.
faith and Christian
Right.
faith with respect to origins.
yes,
So how would you say that this book impacts your understanding of your vocation?
of my vocation. Well, I mean, I've always thought my vocation was connected to my faith. It's hard to describe, I guess, for me, how this impacted it. It was interesting to me how he sought unity between the both, and how an in-depth understanding of both the science and scripture, he found a way for them to work together. He didn't just take conventional views of science either. He pointed out how some things like gradual evolution wasn't accurate. He wasn't saying that science trumps, So I appreciated that it's possible to see the validity of both without having to say that from a scientist's point of view, science should be the first one to have the first word or the last word, if that makes sense. Science in the end rules. He wasn't saying that. He sought a way to make both work, which was something I haven't seen before. Even looking at stuff in class, I've noticed that they talk about both being equal. They say that our theology should be reformed by science, and he didn't try to do that. So I appreciated that. That doesn't really answer your question, though.
So you appreciate the concordist connection.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions from the audience? Look through that little rubric there, get the keywords, and see if you've got the answers to this. Let's see what other Christian attitudes and practices that faithfully correspond to their place within God's mission in the world. I think
The whole thing is kind of related to that.
Okay. All right, let's thank Ms. Hoyt again. Thank you for a few minutes.
Thanks, really.